Well, hello again on yet another beautiful spring day. It's David Willey from the Tank Museum, still not at the Tank Museum. And what I'm going to have now is a session, or a bit of a ramble, I think would be a better word, on camouflage. And I'll be talking about camouflage from the point of view of really 20th century camouflage. A little bit about uniforms, something about vehicles as well, but we haven't got access to the Tank Museum's collection, so what you're looking at around me at the moment is just things I've been able to dig out to help support some of the stories and the things I want to touch on. Now, as you can imagine, camouflage is an enormous subject because it touches so many different areas of the way the military acts, how it dresses, how it paints vehicles, etc. And one of the things I just wanted to mention right at the beginning is from the point of view of camouflage, how I'm going to look at it is inevitably I'll touch on areas which really actually fall outside what the military would define as camouflage, but inevitably most of us, we always associate this idea a little bit about subterfuge, deception, camouflage as we see it, as we often think of, especially if you're a model maker or you collect uniforms or something other than camouflage that's on a piece of equipment. And these things often actually merge because it's all part of that, historically goes back to the beginning of warfare, that art of warfare where what you're trying to do is deceive your enemy. Where is your attack going in? How many men or what equipment do you have? And that, of course, is something that actually stretches away from just the colouring of a uniform, but it touches all those other areas as well. So some of this I'll bring in here and there, but I repeat again now at the beginning, this won't be covering everything. So if you want to start putting in the comments, I'm surprised you didn't mention, well, start now, because there'll be a lot of stuff I won't cover off. But I want to take us back really to that idea, that the idea of camouflage in terms of the military in a uniform, that's been around a long time. We're always we love this idea, don't we, about people dressing in these, for Napoleonic era, in these particularly outstanding colours to identify you as part of this force or as part of that side, and the regiments within that force as well. That starts changing actually, you know, that progress through the 19th century, it starts changing quite earlier than perhaps sometimes we think. But the knowledge that to dress in a different way so you don't stand out has been used by the militaries quite early on. And so you'll see these Jaegers, these units where they're using green or darker colours for what we'd now perhaps start calling snipers or sharpshooters, people that were going to pick people off or hide around the place. That actually is happening much earlier in the 19th century than perhaps people think, and it's gone on before then as well in the outfits of certain people before. What I wanted to look at though really is from the beginning of the 20th century, when Britain is already, as a country, we've gone from, due to the Boer War, gone from a certain types of red dress for field service uniforms, and we've moved over to khaki. Now, khaki is an Urdu word. It means dust-coloured. Picked up from the British in India. There was a period where white uniforms were being dyed with tea or other things so that they would look more dust-coloured, all with the intention you don't stand out as much on the battlefield or you don't make yourself a particular target. Now, Britain had introduced this. Germany introduced before the First World War the field grey outfit, which again, from the point of view of trying to look duller on the battlefield. France has just developed a new type of uniform when it goes into service, or sorry, it goes off to war in 1914. That uniform hasn't been issued and it's not actually ready yet. So France goes off still with its red facings on its jackets and a much more what looks like earlier 19th century colour on a lot of its uniform that it's there at the beginning there. But the idea of making yourself less conspicuous on the battlefield, that's not brand new to World War I. What quickly happens though in the First World War is this idea that actually you do not want to stand out in the landscape. And France, again, very quickly starts looking at replacing its earlier with its red facings, red trousers, etc., that type of part of its uniform. They want to get rid of that. And they start, as well as many other countries, looking at the issue of camouflage, and it's really the French that take the lead on that. And this is where we come to this interesting crossover between camouflage and its association with artists, because very early on it's French artists who are the ones that are suggesting or coming up with some ideas for, we need to now start hiding men and equipment on the operations they're on, and how do we go about doing that. So even before Christmas of 1914, the French have set up some initial camouflage units. They are starting to come up with ideas of suits for soldiers to wear that have been painted on. They come up with a palette range, in other words, a series of different colours that are associated with certain areas of the battlefront, so that if you choose these colours, if you're going to make something such as camouflage netting or Hessian screens as they were made, raffia, etc. was being used. If you're going to put them in one part of the front, these are the tonalities, the colours that you need to pick on, because they seem to be relevant to that particular area. And of course they start using some of the artists themselves' talents about breaking up outlines and picking on that pre-war art movement of basically cubism, or the Fauves, where they're looking at these angular shapes to break up outline and put patterning on things. So there's that lovely line, Gertrude Stein, she's sitting with Picasso, and one of these artillery pieces rumbles past, all with this blockish camouflage on, and Picasso says to her, "We did that," pointing at it as if like this is really cubist art going past. Now the British follow up on the French. They're later to the subject. The word camouflage, by the way, it's not in common use. The ideas have been around beforehand. You know, Darwin's talked about the way animals have this protective pigmentation. Thayer, an American, who writes a great big tome on all this just before the First World War, very influential for a period. The conversations about looking at how nature does things. But the word camouflage really comes to the fore in the First World War in such a way that if I find the quote, it's really not a word that's particularly well known beforehand. But here we go. This is from a magazine article, the Athenaeum, a magazine that was published 23rd May 1919. Camouflage, a word that has met with more wear and tear in a few months than many receive in a century. And basically earlier, when introduced this word to the public, they'd used the phrase as well in 17 of saying it's an act of hiding anything from your enemy. Yeah, so this idea of the concept of trying to hide things, it's not new, but the word is being used in the First World War for the first time. The British set up out in Wimereux in France. They end up putting together a special works, they call it, department, which ends up emulating much of what the French are doing. They then in South Kensington set up a special works department there, which does the same sort of thing. And the range of things is not just about patterning material or Hessian or canvas. It's also about doing things such as making paper mache heads. And these are used in the front line. They're sometimes put on you know, as if they're looking around the corner or something. A sniper would shoot at that head thinking it's a real one. And some of these, when you actually see the photographs of them, you know, they really go through from the very basic to superbly recreated heads. And again, you know, you can see how the artists, the sculptor, the painters getting involved in all this. And what they'd wait for is wait till a sniper shoots at that paper mache head. They'd take it down, and then they'd end up putting a rod through it so they could actually work out the angle of entry of the bullet and therefore line that up with a projection of where that sniper might be firing from. They did other ones where they would put dummies out in no man's land overnight. It's a dummy they'd have on the end of a string so they could have it moving, so it might make people come and reveal their positions, etc. There was all sorts of clever ways, even to the point of creating enormous backdrops that were used almost theatrically to actually pretend a landscape goes on, something ends or something begins, and you end up, you know, there's one on a railway line where instead of the lines going off into the distance, it's painted by scene painters in such a way that if they were looking through binoculars into the distance, it looked like it goes off in another direction. So all of these arts, from the stage productions, from painters, from all these different sorts of sculptures, etc., all come to the fore and are actually used by the military in the First World War. The Americans start their own camouflage school as well. The Germans as well, they look at camouflage and start taking it very seriously, probably a bit later than, certainly all the countries take it later than the French. And again, the Germans, as you'll recall if you've seen those pictures of their Stahlhelms, they actually have them painted in set colours to again break up the outline. Now, in the First World War as well, one of the classic areas of camouflage that often gets picked up on, and again it goes back to that association with artists. Sorry about this, let me just hold my notes here down a little way. That one. In April of 1917, there was 55 ships were sunk in 1 month, and that led, or sorry, in 1 week, I've actually got my notes here, so 55 ships being sunk by U-boats in a week. That led to someone called Norman Wilkinson, who was in the Royal Navy at the time. He realised, yes, you can paint ships grey, you can do all sorts of things trying to make them merge with their backgrounds, but the truth is a ship on the water is pretty obvious for most people to see. It's going to make a bow wave, it's going to always contrast, you'll never have it the right colour at the right time. So Norman Wilkinson comes up with the idea that we now know as dazzle ships. So why not break up the outline of the ship and facet it, change these angles on it, paint patterns on it that will make it harder, and this is his intention, for somebody, for example, the U-boat captain looking through his periscope, is it coming towards him or is it going away from him? Where does it begin? Where does it end? And in this, they are emulating, again, so many of these things, when you look at it, what they're emulating is ideas from nature. Think to the idea of the zebra. Yes, in certain types of terrain, a zebra looks, it might blend in. You know, lions, who are zebra's main predator, you know, that they're after them, they're actually colourblind lions. So actually this idea of the black and white within grassland and certain types of shrub is going to work quite well, you know, this idea of breaking it up. But more importantly, naturalists think that probably that lines on there, when you have a herd of zebras and they're running together, the idea of the lion going for it, where does one animal end and where does another begin, etc. So the lunge, the moment, will it be in the right way? And that's exactly what Norman Wilkinson was trying to achieve when he's doing dazzle ships. Now, the British Navy, we take on the idea of dazzle ships. There's always this joke about paint manufacturers thought he was the best thing since sliced bread because it meant repainting huge numbers of ships with this dazzle pattern camouflage on. The US Navy, Wilkinson goes to America, the US Navy takes it on for its merchant fleet, etc. There's a number of studies. Whether it really achieved its aim is hard to tell. But again, it was another part of, seemed to be doing something, and also it made the crews feel better. It looked like we were doing something about this U-boat threat. And again, so vast numbers of ships were painted in what looks now to us such a modernistic scheme that was being done from 1917 onwards. It tended to fade out in the interwar period. It re-emerges in World War II. It's done in slightly different ways, but actual dazzle painting happens again in World War II. So again, back to artists, Edward Wadsworth, a British artist, was one of the teams that was actually sent inspecting and helping the dockyards paint. And he does a series of prints and some gorgeous paintings of those dazzle ships that again, this idea of the art and the camouflage are merging all the time. And if you look at the Imperial War Museum, and again, British artists were actually commissioned as well. There was a War Artist Advisory Scheme. Let's get the artists to record this phenomenal event that we've never had before in our history, World War I. So they're sent off to actually record this. And again, some of these artists cross over into their different spheres, from camouflage to actually the enacting of camouflage onto ships, for example, in Wadsworth's case. Again, I think with that one as well, there's another element that comes in, certainly with dazzle pattern, etc., because immediately the war's over, 1919, you can see bathing suits are made in dazzle camouflage, ball dresses. There's the Chelsea Arts Ball has a black and white one, and every other person seems to be in some form of dazzle pattern outfit. So this idea of how camouflage leaches straight into fashion, and nowadays it comes back the other way with so many militaries. You know, this idea of the military outfit and fashion, we mentioned it already before in certain other talks, but in this particular area straight away, dazzle pattern, you know, it appears on an awful lot of other products the minute the world war's over. So what other things can we talk about in terms of the First World War? Well, one of them is for tanks. There's a Royal Academician called Solomon J. Solomon, and he is being asked by the military to help with camouflage work, and he's one of the people that comes up with the first ideas, and well, they're copying the French, but he's one of the first ones who's actually sees through the production of one of these hollow trees with a stepladder as a lookout post that's erected out in France overnight. And this idea about they're made sometimes behind the line, they're put up together quite quickly because obviously you don't want the people studying the front line, number one, not see it go up, but number two, that it has to either replace or blend in very, very well with the surrounding scenery. Solomon's doing that, but he's asked to go along to Thetford in Norfolk to have a look at how could we camouflage the first tanks. Now, one of the issues, again, coming back to this palette of colours, Solomon is wondering how on earth they can get what is it really like on the front line. Could I have an idea where these tanks are going to be used so that whatever colours I choose could help blend? And that's another one of these things that for us it seems fairly obvious today. Actually, for a number of the people at the time, getting anywhere near the front line or getting concrete information out of the serving army out in the field was quite hard work. But what Solomon ended up doing, he paints a whole Mark I tank up at Thetford, and the rest, it looks like the rest of the crews then park up their tanks and copy the tank that he's designed and painted. And that's called the Solomon scheme, and that's what we've got painted on our Mark I tank that's on the diorama, the last Mark I left, that's in the museum, coming over the top of the trench there, as it was in that first tank attack in September of 1916. Now, Solomon, whether he saw the outcome of that attack, but basically the Solomon scheme goes by the way quite quickly, because one of the issues that those tanks have had is as they cross the battlefield, as you know, on the rhomboid-shaped tank, the track's going all the way around the outside. That means mud is carried around the whole of the outer structure of the tank as the tracks are going round. That tends to run down the side, and even if you have got a lovely camouflage scheme, very quickly that runoff of the mud drying on the side, you end up with a fairly monochrome looking vehicle. And so quite quickly you'll see there's one or two Mark II tanks. Sometimes you've got a sponson that's removed and reused again, but quickly you'll see actually there becomes a monotone brown, a British Army standard colour is painted, and it's again, we've got a model that was made at the factory where they made tanks in the First World War, and we really think it's not been repainted. It's been in a case most of its life. That is the colour, so we've chosen that one to replicate for when we paint our tanks. Charming phrases used about it: dog turd brown, all sorts of things were described, but it's really just a muddy brown, and that becomes a standard. You will see individual tanks are painted in different schemes, and there were other ideas coming forward as time went on throughout the First World War to how you might better camouflage tanks. So that Solomon scheme goes by the by. There's still talk of coming up, there's someone called Percy Judas Hart, and he comes up with a zigzag scheme. He's asked to, he tries a number of different schemes. There's some items of his, like a sniper outfit he did that's in the Imperial War Museum. We've got a superb, huge model of a First World War tank that he painted to try his scheme on, which looks again very modernistic, but it's lots of lines and zigzag sections. But there's also a photograph where it seems to have been applied to a netting structure that was carried over the top of the tank, presumably to help camouflage it from above as well. And that's another thing where we then immediately, Percy Tudor Hart's scheme, by the way, he gets very frustrated about all this, because a lot of his schemes, if you read his memoir, which I've got a copy there, a lot of his schemes are rejected by the militaries, and he's very frustrated because he thinks he should be helping the war effort better by doing this. But one of those points as well that straight away comes out is how do you hide your tank from above? And again, Solomon's part of this. There's publications made, and they're looking at, number one is how you can, even at your base, your tankerdrome, wherever the rear area where the tanks are, don't line them up out in the open, don't give them a sort of a sense so that if someone's flying over photo reconnaissance, they can count them, look at them, or bomb them from the air. When they go forward, they're heavily camouflaged quite quickly. And again, this word we now perhaps call fieldcraft, the idea that you cover your tracks behind you quite quickly. So if a tank's gone forward, don't let it be seen. So cover those over. So it's not just the camouflage on the vehicle, it's how you treat things around it. And that goes through onto the Second World War as well. You know, all these manuals, they'll tell you about camouflage in one sense, but they also relate it to the fieldcraft of how you operate, how you access the vehicle, where you go to it, what's likely to work in a wider context. So for example, I mentioned earlier about Bill Bellamy's memoirs, great read there. He gets really mad because he's camouflaged his tank in the corner of the field, and he sees two senior officers walking straight across the field, making a beeline straight for his tank. You don't do that, because if anybody's watching or is looking from a distance, if it seems to be they're going to a single point, you know there's something interesting there. You should be skirting around the edge of the field, you should be trying to hide, keep behind a hedge line, etc., doing things that way, because otherwise your initial camouflage, if it's just everything's leading to it, including pathways, cables, etc., if it seems to be going to a central place, all that camouflage netting over the top to hide what's underneath, forget it, it's not doing anyone any good. Now, in terms of actual materials, most uniforms in the First World War don't use camouflage, but there are areas where camouflage comes into play. And one, of course, is with sniping and the ghillie suit. Now, sniping, here's another lovely, fascinating factor. Sniping, the word sniping comes from when you're going off to shoot snipe, a bird that was very hard to shoot because of its habits. So sniping, you've got to be good at what you're doing. Ghillie suit, ghillie's a Scottish word, it basically means servant. In the past, up in the Highlands, they used to get sometimes some of the ghillies, they'd help on a shoot, but also they'd be the ones that'd be looking out for poachers, and sometimes they dressed up to blend in with the landscape, to lure the poacher on, as it were, or to hide from the poacher, to be able to sort of, so they weren't scared off, so they could grab a poacher that way. Now again, in the First World War, a number of sniper suits are designed or painted or adapted by those users, and fairly quickly, again, it's fairly obvious. You can see they've got hoods, a face stands out. If you've got brown, etc., all around you, the mud or a bit of green if you've got some vegetation, but a white face stands out. So you either camouflage your face or you put a hood over the top. So you'll see a lot of these early experimental suits where the French in particular, they're painting them beautifully, pointillistic finishes, you know, sort of dabs of colour all over, sometimes with a hood on. In Britain, the idea of the ghillie suit, they start adding bits of hessian, bits of cloth, bits of other things, so it ends up looking like a sort of, I don't know, a bit of a Chewbacca come sort of rag covered suit. But that blends in very nicely with its different colours, and if someone's sitting there, still used to this day by different snipers. And over time, one of the things that happens with ghillie suits, so they've done things now such as putting in with the undersuit a protective level or way of trying to reduce the heat signature, and they've even some today where they've actually got a charcoal-based liner, so it sucks up any of the smell of the person, because the story is out in Afghanistan, some of the snipers there, all of a sudden the local goats were sniffing them out, being able to wander over and wondering what's this. So you don't want to give away your scent, as well as what we're used to seeing, you know, on the visual spectrum. You don't want to be able to see that person. And those ghillie suits, if you've ever been to one of those demonstrations, you know, like the British Army always does it up on Salisbury Plain, where they start shooting, say to the audience watching, right, you know, where's the nearest sniper, and everyone's pouring across the landscape with their binoculars, and suddenly this guy steps up in front of you about 2 yards away, and everyone wets their knickers because they didn't think he was quite there. You know, that art of wearing a ghillie suit and being able to manoeuvre without being seen, using the camouflage, but using the landscape is vitally important as well. That of course is still taught to many militaries all around the world today. Great story in the Mark Urban book, I think it's in his Big Boys Rules book, about how the, I think it was an SAS patrol or 14 platoon, whatever it was, in Northern Ireland, hiding, and the IRA guys they were watching literally came over and nearly peed on them, didn't know they were there, they were that well hidden in the bush at the time. So the camouflage is being used in the First World War, it is there, but it's not so prevalent. It's only about 1929 that for the first time it's the Italian army ends up printing a pattern that they start using for tentage, for a cape, and for uniforms as well. Later on they get used for as well. But then you'll see the Soviets experiment in the 30s with camouflage suiting. The Germans issued their first bit of camouflage kit in 1931 to their military on a regular basis, and I've got one here. This is the Zeltbahn, or Zeltbahn, which is basically a triangle of cloth that's waterproofed, and this has got what they call the army splinter pattern on it, and as a triangle it can be used in two different ways. It's got a hole in the middle that can go over your head, and it can be used as a poncho, so you can wear it over that way. There's even a manual that goes with the Zeltbahn, which go through pages and pages of all these one things you can do with it, as it were. But the key ones is wear it as a poncho, or with about 4 of them, I think it is, together, you can make a pup tent to sleep under, or you and your mates can, as it were, or your other serving soldiers. And this is starting to be issued from 1931. It's issued throughout the war, go through a number of changes. And of course that touches on this enormous subject, which is camouflage uniforms in general, but also in particular people get very excited about German camouflage. And even in my lifetime, the different names, you know, from splinter pattern, all the different names, mossy oak, various different things that they've tried to describe these German camouflage schemes. Basically there's 2 main strands. The army or the Wehrmacht in general has one type of camouflage. Waffen-SS tends to go down another route. Most of the army ones tend to be splinter pattern ones. The Waffen-SS tend to use all these broken up more rounder shaped ones in lots of different ways. And just behind me here, one of the things I brought out, this is a replica one, but a bit of an idea of one of those smocks. These are being used by the SS as early as 39-40. You'll see them in the fighting, but like many, one of the simple things you do is you actually print 2 different camouflage so that it's reversible, and that was done in a manner so that straight away you could just turn it inside out on the nature of the terrain. Now there's plenty, if you're interested in German camouflage, because of course, you know, for vehicles and everything, everyone gets very excited about what they were up to. At the end of the war, I think it was a guy called Richardson, an American, does a report in it. They've reprinted that. You can get yourself a copy of that. And the Germans, of course, were also looking towards the end of the war. They've gone through this huge range of different camouflage finishes. Some of them don't go into service. Some of them were actually printed but not actually made up. Some of them, and again, there's this massive area out there of fakes. It's really interesting reading one of the books that actually takes out of the Brassey's camouflage books, which is I think on the list as well here. One of the other books points out that Brassey's have actually reproduced a photograph of a pair of German peas pattern, as they call it, trousers, which are complete fakes. And that idea about how things are sometimes made from original materials, put together to go onto the market. Goodness knows now with all this reproduction stuff how we'll be able to tell that in the future. So if you're going to spend some money on these things, you know, unless you're very, very wealthy, buy yourself a good repro one, because they look very good, and obviously you can wear it walking the dog if you really are that way inclined. But watch it with the what's called genuine stuff, because there is so much stuff out there, and you really, really do need to know your stuff if you're going to spend all these, you know, lots and lots of money on just getting a bit of original German camo. I think Zeltbahns are still out there in quite large quantities, so maybe that one's not so bad. But the issue at the end of the German, when they're making camouflage in 44, 45, they're also getting into, because for the first time we're now getting into the infrared or near infrared part of the spectrum, and they're actually making camouflage with dyes in that will mean you don't stand up. And that's another thing that modern camouflage, sometimes we're looking at it, it's actually meeting not just the visual spectrum that we're used to seeing, but also thermal and other areas, an infrared one. The British have got the Tabby system coming into play. Germans are starting to use an infrared cameras. You see them on their some of those late model Panthers, etc. So they're looking at camouflage schemes. And I always remember, reading about some of that in books. Was it really true? Did it really happen? Then I went to the German technical collection at Koblenz. There's one all in a suit, in a case there, all done up. They've got a complete suit. They're all original and absolutely fascinating. Now, of course, with the internet, you can find out lots more about this stuff very much more quicker, and things are corrected a lot quicker as well. So the German equipment in the war, lots and lots and lots written about it. Plenty of books out there as well if you do get into that, when it comes into service, who wears it and why. One of the other countries that's going to be looking at camouflage, America, again, it's done some experimentation in the 30s. It's only when the war began and the loss of the Philippines that the Americans then really quickly look at camouflage for uniforms. And one of the things they come up with quite quickly is what becomes known as a duck hunting pattern, or something along the lines of, I'm just getting where duck hunter is a phrase I believe they ended up using. But what ends up happening with Americans is that or their development, they quite quickly need something out in the field. It's MacArthur ordering suits. Look, we can't hang around for this. So you'll see lovely photographs of Americans experimenting with different types of materials out in the desert and all sorts of places. But quite quickly, they end up getting a camouflage together that goes out in two patterns to go out to the jungle. And this is actually a US Marine cape, but one of the jungle 5 pattern is on one side. That's got 5 patterns, and the other side has got 3 patterns, which is a lighter for beaches or other sorts of areas. And that pattern is made up into herringbone suits. Again, just like this, printed the 2 types on either side, so you can reverse them, take them around. Ends up making them a bit hot because of the nature of the fabric they're using. But they do try to use this pattern. Again, it's used out in Normandy initially in 44. You'll see photographs of guys wearing these. First of all, they had overall suits, as it were, made up with them. Then they made them 2-part to be easier to dress and do all your ablutions in the field, etc. But they become, you'll read all the stories quite quickly. There's a worry because even though the camouflage is supposed to be hiding you, the problem is if your camouflage looks like the enemy's camouflage and someone sees you, you're going to get shot at. And this was considered too similar to the camouflage being used by the Germans. 1 or 2 blue-on-blue incidents, as they're called, and that type of camouflage is withdrawn from Northwest Europe quite quickly, so it doesn't see any more use out there. So what's Britain up to? Britain ends up with, it's just got its battle dress, it's got its serge, or it's got its denims before the war. We're not over keen on camouflage uniforms, apart from, yet again, 1 or 2 very small areas such as sniping. But when we start using camouflage, what comes along is it's in response really to, first of all, we look at the suit that the German paratroopers are using, and we emulate that for paratroopers. So there's this kind of step-in overall, coverall that goes on for the first paratroopers. And then Major Dennison comes up with the Dennison smock in about 1942. And that is painted on with big broad brush strokes. In fact, they were actually saying that probably the material was laid out on the floor, and for the first pattern of the Dennison smock, probably it was mopped. So you see these big brush strokes. Now, those first pattern, the material, the cotton that is laid out, the dyes that are used are actually ones that when they get wet, they start merging. So actually the colours, the original outlines that were painted on seem to merge together, and they seem to fade as well. But I'm just going to show you, because we have the advantage here. I've got a first pattern Dennison. So there's one of those German smocks, by the way. This here is a first pattern Dennison, which hasn't been issued and is in very good order. And you can see, if holding that up there, I don't know if you can see these big broad brush strokes of, and there's little bits where you can see where the brush has been, where this was put on. First pattern, by the way, woolly cuffs here, doesn't have any securing for taking the tail up, and again, half-length zip up the top, blanket lines, Angola wool, just remember that one as well, not Angora. And you can also see that the pockets are actually from separate bits of material that are actually sewn on the top of it all. So that's first pattern. Second pattern that comes along ends up, they use a different type of more permanent dyes, but one of the things I would just point out as well is, again, look at the colourings on these things, and one of those issues with camouflage, and here's another example as well, how the fading and the different, even though those brush strokes are really clear there on the British camouflage that's used on the Denison, actually what ends up happening though is, depending on when they're issued, this one looks much more reddy brown, they end up washing and wearing into very different ways of tonality. So when you're looking at these things as well, it's quite hard sometimes. If it's newly issued, it looks a much darker, richer colour, but that quickly goes when it's exposed to water and the atmosphere, etc., and use, of course. And just because, of course, you're all interested in first, second pack. And one of the other issues is that for paratroopers, they were given, because someone also mentioned in one of the questions, these were the denim oversuits that you try to put over the top of all your gear when you drop down. They have little grenade pockets in the front there, and that's in that green denim. And again, a lot of times as well, so this one is not camouflaged at all. You took this off as soon as you've landed, and you tended to then wear all your webbing on the outside of your Denison. But that was a British colour scheme that was used. There was another colour scheme. If you look back onto where we did about tank suits, we mention about as well the camouflage tank suit. It has its own camouflage scheme, and very similar. This was a camouflage suit. These are the trousers that are actually dated 1943, and you'll see in late 44, early 45 British soldiers wearing. It's a lightweight, windproof cotton, but it's really a camouflage suit. And there was a smock top to it, and again you can see with brush strokes and the different colourings here. So Britain was getting into its camouflage. It just doesn't see the amount of usage that you do, certainly with the German army, and to a certain degree as well. I haven't got any Soviet stuff here to show you, but the Soviet army. And there's another obvious area of camouflage as well in terms of uniforms, which is this idea of, again, snow camouflage. So you just put on white clothing, or white with a bit of something to break up if it's continually white, and again for helmet camouflage as well. So there's some of the uniforms there. One of the other things about camouflage in the Second World War is this business about how do you teach people to use camouflage. So yes, camouflage for uniforms, but what do you do when it comes to actually, just trying to find my notebook, what do you actually do when it comes to actually fieldcraft and use of camouflage? So for example, here I've got, this is an American net, camouflage net there, all wrapped up still with that lovely smell to it. A net on its own doesn't do an awful lot, so what you have to do is add to that net with local foliage. So if you're putting it over your vehicle, you then pick foliage out, weave it into the net, so it then blends into what's around you. And again, these are all the sorts of things. So again, for vehicles, it's shape, shine, shadow, things that you're taught. And in Britain, in the Second World War, they put together a camouflage school, and yet again, I come back to artists, a number of serious artists are drawn into that camouflage school and start coming up with ideas about how this was going to be used. And one of those artists was a chap called Roland Penrose, and he's got the great good fortune of knowing Lee Miller. Now again, if you look up Lee Miller, she was a model for people like Man Ray and a number of the surrealists in the 30s. She was absolutely beautiful, and she also went on, she was a great journalist and she was a photographer, and she ended up working for Condé Nast, I think it is, who published Vogue, and she goes out as a photographer. Now she very gallantly posed nude and let Roland Penrose paint her, because Roland Penrose ends up teaching the Home Guard, the British Home Guard, and he makes a manual, a Home Guard camouflage manual. How is it, what's the best way to do your camouflage? It's not just, as I mentioned, getting a net. How do you actually use that? And to spice up his lectures, which is why we've got a young lady down there with no clothes on, if you've been able to pick out, spice up his lectures, he would actually put in a slide of Lee Miller naked under a camo sheet or painted suitably to a camouflage, just to keep the guys, you know, awake, and just to see, you know, because what is it that's going to make you remember? And I was interested to read, because that's one of those stories I've known for quite some time. But actually I went and found the Americans did very much the same sort of thing, because there was a young lady called Chili Williams in America, and she did some photographs for the engineers, I think it was, in America. And she's got a fantastic pair of legs, and she blends into the background, or she wears something with a little motto in. And one of the American engineers in charge of all this is his quote, because these were published in photographs issued out to all the troops, so they have something to pin on the wall and at the same time learn a good lesson, one hopes. And it says here of her, what she put together for them: vital principles are impressed on their minds of camouflage students in a most effective manner. That's what the American chief engineer said about it. So that idea about how you're engaging the troops, think of the tiger feeble, etc. If you bring some young ladies in, that's another one of those ones where keeps people's interest, as no doubt you've been looking. And by the way, the picture down there is by Fortunino Matania, who was the guy, that's his wife, so he's allowed to do it. He's the guy that painted all those wonderful illustrations of the First World War for the Sphere magazine. He did that famous one of Goodbye Old Friend, the Blue Cross one of the guy saying goodbye to his horse that's on the ground, you know, before running off. A wonderful artist as an illustrator, really, and some lovely books out now on his wartime work and other bits he did as well. So that's why I've dug out my Fortino Matania and put it down there, so you can see how you are now going to remember. Well, I don't know if you are going to remember. We'll see if that sort of system works for you. Another one of the artists that was being used, so Roland Penrose is there, another one of the artists. Lot of great British names come in there: William Hayter, Edwin Liddell, that's a print by Edwin Liddell down there, 1946. As soon as they come out, they worked with the camouflage unit. Some were then commissioned as war artists as well. That's part of a series called School Prints that was done just after war to illustrate. Beautiful number of great British artists were used to come up with these posters that were used to basically, they were called school prints because they were going to go in classrooms, etc. But he worked for the camouflage unit as well. I was just weird, you know, how you suddenly notice things sitting around the place, but I've had that print some years. And another one of these people that the British used and goes to the camouflage school at Farnham and then is sent out to North Africa is Jasper Maskelyne. And he was a magician before the war, and he starts trying to use some of his deception ideas out with the 8th Army. And again, there's been some lovely programs. There's a book on him and how he's coming up with these, how might we use some of those skills to mask what we're trying to do. And that ranges from hiding things such as a tank, put a structure over the top of it so it ends up looking like a truck or something or other. You know, lots of different things that way. He even does one scheme is to try and hide. Water is always a really great navigation point for bombers, and there's one time where he's actually trying a scheme to actually hide the Suez Canal of all things, so any German planes flying over won't be able to locate where they are. Similarly in Germany at the same time, you know, they end up, once the Allied bombing campaign gets going, the Germans start a massive campaign of trying to hide buildings or building dummy buildings or hiding areas such as like in Hamburg where the river basin is. They actually put netting over the top and painted what looked like on top, roughly continuing the street plans as if a road that would end by the edge of the river. No, it doesn't. It goes on the netting over the top. So all these ideas are being used in a number of different countries. But Maskelyne's a great story, and he helps the 8th Army. And one of the other things, of course, with using deception, you can't do deception badly because then it's obvious. So if you do, as before the Battle of Alamein, they do this massive build-up of forces in the south to try and get the idea that Rommel, will buy into there's going to be an attack in the south, not actually where it comes in the north. But if you make them too obvious, having all these dummy trucks and everything else around the place, it's going to be obvious it's a dummy. So you have to pretend to hide what you've done. So they do water pipes. They give it a couple of days. They hide some of it. They try and camouflage these dummy gun emplacements, these massive, great pretend stores that they're putting there. but not that well. Just so hopefully the German planes flying over will buy into this. And I think it certainly works, but Alamein is the Germans genuinely don't know exactly where the attack's coming in. So that part of that deception. The Russians, of course, were brilliant at this. They're doing it all the time in their operations, and they're the art, and they've carried that on. So many Western or NATO countries looking at how they do deception. It's almost part of the Russian sort of psyche. The way they go about things is keeping that at a fundamental, core of what they're up to. Deception again goes on obviously in the UK with Operation Fortitude, ready for the D-Day landings. So we see all those pictures of blown up dummy tanks that you could blow. None of those, sadly, I know someone asked one of the questions about that, none of those have survived because the rubber and the glues, they perish over time. You can buy modern blow-up tanks that are still used on exercises, etc. But you can't get any of those, none of those wartime ones are left, sadly. And they did things like landing barges in the Thames that were just out of plywood, etc. Actually, for Fortitude, the greatest effect that had on that plan was the fact that all the German agents in the UK in the double cross system had been either imprisoned or turned, and we were feeding false information back from radio transmitters back to the Germans, and that information, along with false radio traffic for dummy units. So the American 603rd Battalion from the engineers come over with a lot of people from Hollywood, from the film industry, etc., coming up with these dummy things. It's that radio traffic that is a best sell to the Germans because, of course, by this stage of the war, the number of photo reconnaissance missions they're able to put out is limited, and actually they're picking up on the radio much more, and that's what's having its effect on the Germans. So just running through then, so I'll just mention, I think I've covered an awful lot of the things I wanted to. Just ending up, one of the things I've not really talked that much about vehicles, and the problem there is that we can talk about that when we're back at the museum because you can see the camouflage on the vehicles. And I know a lot of you model makers, if you look, we've done one particular film on the painting of German Tiger tanks using the German RAL numbers. When we reopen the World War II gallery, you'll see we've repainted a number of the British tanks. So there's a desert scheme called the Caunter scheme. There's other schemes, what was the rule of thumb for the British? Well, we start with something, they often call it the Mickey Mouse scheme earlier in the war years, black and brown. If American vehicles turn up, the rules were just leave them in the American olive drab unless there's a need to repaint them, but otherwise we're quite happy with that. And there's different orders for how you camouflage vehicles throughout the war. And again, you'll see as well in local camouflage, applying a mud or whitewash in snowy weather, etc. You can see all that. But I'm afraid to say we're going to probably have to talk about those when we've got the vehicles there, or a better way of being able to illustrate that when they're back at the museum. So I hope that doesn't disappoint you too much. But I mentioned camouflage netting earlier. And again, when you look at those vehicles, there's the Hessian draped netting. Again, Hessian was sewn on. Lots of women were back on the home front. You'd get a standard net and you'd sew on all the bits to go on the outside, different colour schemes for different areas of the world that it might be being sent to. But they also used on tanks, you'll see as well, that was often called a shrimp net. And it was a much finer netting that was sometimes draped over things. Sometimes this is not just like on here. So here's a net on the helmet. Doesn't really do anything. Yes, you might say it breaks up some of the outline or some of the shine, but it's only when you apply further things to that net does it then start really doing its job to blend in. And as I mentioned on the headgear one, actually for tank crew, that's not really that essential from the point of view, that big tank is going to be seen anyway. It's only when you're away from the vehicle you might want to actually break up the outline of your helmet that you're wearing that way. Moving on after the war years, again, there was a tendency straight away to revert back to non-camouflage weapons. If you look at it overall, Britain, we didn't have our DPM disruptive pattern material camo like on this rubberized oversuit here. This pattern doesn't come in till later in the 1960s. It's designed earlier in the 60s. That serves the British military for about 40 years, and it was only in about 2010 that multi-terrain pattern comes in and is issued to the British Army. The Canadians are first to use digital camouflage on their uniforms. The American Army copies the Canadian one pretty much. But even there, you know, the idea of digital pixelated, it's sometimes called, that breaking up, when they've done tests, a good pixelated camouflage, it's about 2.5 seconds to pick up that person wearing that, compared to about 1 second on a normal traditional type of camouflage. So that's why you can understand that short bit of time difference can make a big deal of difference. So a lot of countries have gone for that. Doesn't always work though, because again, the Americans did a lot of experimentation in the early 2000s, went for this. In the end, they chose different things. Someone overruled it, came out with this universal pattern. Off they went to Afghanistan, and very quickly that was criticised, gets up to Congress level, and new patterns have to come out. So we still make, well, I say we, countries still make a lot of time and energy goes into camouflage, but nowadays I would emphasise again, it's much more about that overall spectrum, infrared, heat signatures, especially with vehicles, electromagnetic spectrum, what's coming out other than what you can just see, which makes me laugh, because in a sense, we've gone more down the routes of visual camouflage in the last 20-30 years. You know, look at the plethora of patterns out there, when in fact that's probably now not one of the key areas about why people will be wearing camouflage. And I would argue again, as I've said before, and looking at other uniform things we've done, some of this is to do with national identity. It's obviously to do with identifying your crew. Some of it, of course, it's about deception. Of course, it's about hiding the people there. But a lot of the time as well, it's about what I might call fashion. The vast majority of uniforms that are out there being printed at the moment in so many different ways, you know, including just, you know, the vast majority are about fashion, not the military. And, you know, there's £1 billion industry in America alone just for hunting clothing. And you're looking at things like, you know, after that duck pattern in the 1960s, it was based on the wartime American pattern. 1980, I've forgotten the chap's name, who comes up with what starts as real tree, mossy oak, you know, and then that's led to, and he purposely wanted to do a camouflage scheme that identified that you weren't part of that military background. You know, this is a different type of camouflage scheme. So there's a lot out there that you can imagine we could talk about or cover, and already I've, as ever, gone on a lot longer than I should have really have done. But hopefully that's something interesting amongst it. Somewhere in there might be something of interest for you on camouflage. I've put out some of the books there that if you're particularly interested. This one, quite hard to find now, Disruptive Pattern Material, Hardy Blechman. Yeah, interesting stuff. It's a huge, beautifully illustrated book. He's trying to argue the case all the time about, wouldn't it be nice if people could wear camo without having to associate with the military all the time? But I hate to say, I don't think he can have his cake and eat it, because you can see he's actually obsessed by military camouflage, but consistently wants to tell you he doesn't like the military. This one here is called Ghost Army, which is about the American unit that comes to Britain to try and do deception. And again, these are always interesting, because you start realising the number of Hollywood fashion designer, Bill Blass, who are the other people that come over. The guy who did the Munsters, he's one of the people there, set designers. Another one, that Brass's book of camouflage, lots of reference shots in there, as well as a bit of a history there. This one I just dug out, that's Percival Tudor Hart, who's the artist who did some of those things in the First World War. Geoffrey Barkus did a book. This one's by Guy Harkup. Geoffrey Barkus's book, he was out there in charge of camouflage in World War II. This was another one, general history, he's getting on a bit now. Out there you'll find countless books on German camouflage. That was the catalogue from the Imperial War Museum. Our lovely picture of the First World War tanks in here with our model, that was on loan to this one. But another lovely catalogue, oops, as it all starts falling apart. And That one is on French military camouflage as well, a whole century of French military camouflage on the vehicles, and there's another one that was done on just the camoufleurs as well, the people who started it all going. So I will finally stop. I hope that's kept you entertained, and hopefully it's in the shot down the front there as well, the little plug. If you do get bored after you're not falling asleep with me waffling on for so long, you can get yourself a nice Tiger or First World War tank jigsaw puzzle, 1,000 pieces. I noticed the First World War tank one's $4.99. That's a blooming good buy for a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. So you can sit there, and as I always finish off by saying, if you do buy something like that from the Tank Museum shop, that helps us as a charity keep going. So as ever, stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.